Hello. The last lecture covered the early stages of Egyptian history, in which the geographical isolation of the country with its strong natural borders of desert and water predisposed Egypt to develop as a single, united, long-lasting culture. The agricultural abundance provided by those clockwork floods of the Nile encouraged a sort of optimistic worldview in which order was dominant and the great natural cycles of life, death, and rebirth modeled by the Nile and the sun influenced Egyptian religion. That splendid isolation, though, came to a traumatic end in the Second Intermediate Period, when the Hyksos, a rather honestly mysterious people from the ancient Near East, invaded and seized the Delta region of Egypt. Some scholars, by the way, have recently tried to argue that we should talk of Hyksos migrations rather than invasions, and that their settling in Lower Egypt was attended by less violence than previous scholars had emphasized. But whether or not they came as conquerors or just migrants taking advantage of a power vacuum, it is clear that from an Egyptian perspective, the Egyptians regarded them as invaders in their sacred land. The Hyksos, however, enjoyed an advantage in combat, and this was due to really two things. They had better metallurgy, and most importantly, they had war chariots. And that was a weapon that previously had been unknown to the Egyptians. When we shift our focus to ancient India and China, we'll also see chariot-using invaders who will come in and affect those early cultures as well. So this will be a recurrent theme. But anyway, when confronted with this new technology, the Egyptians of the Upper Kingdom quickly adopted that new style of warfare themselves. And from then on, chariots become a central part of Egyptian armies for several centuries. Eventually, the Egyptians rally and some strong leaders emerge based on the city of Thebes. And they unite the Egyptians together and begin to push back against the Hyksos. Eventually, they go down, they attack them in Lower Egypt, and the Hyksos are forced out of the Delta. In their kind of rage at these foreigners showing up in their sacred land, the triumphant Egyptians then chase them and actually pursue them all the way as far as Palestine on the eastern coast of the Mediterranean. The reunification of Egypt then inaugurates a new, very, very different era in Egyptian history. And it's going to be something completely different than any of the previous ones we've seen. The new era, this new kingdom is what it's called, and it dates from 1570 BC to about 1075 BC. And this, the new kingdom, is the time of the Egyptian Empire. It's in this era that Egypt becomes an aggressively expansionist state that sends armies far beyond those natural borders. Egypt now reorients itself. Rather than looking inward, it now looks outwards, and it actively seeks the wealth that being an imperial power could bring. To the east, Egyptian domination stretches as far as Syria, Palestine, and even as far as the Euphrates River to Mesopotamia. To the south, Egypt establishes control over the Nubian and the Kushite kingdoms as far as the Fourth Cataract of the Nile. And Nubia is especially important because that was an area rich in gold, and huge amounts of wealth now pour into Egypt as captured booty and as tribute. So Egypt of the New Kingdom is drenched in gold, and the pharaohs of this time are fantastically rich. New Kingdom Egypt had very active diplomatic and trade interactions. So it's not all military, but they're also carrying on trade with the other great kingdoms in Mesopotamia and surrounding regions, such as the Babylonians. At times, they also fight battles against some of these outside empires. And the greatest of these battles were fought against the Hittites. In fact, the very first battle for which real evidence survives, or at least enough evidence that we can reconstruct the course of that battle, is a battle known as the Battle of Kadesh, which was fought in 1274 BC between the New Kingdom pharaoh Ramses II and the Hittite king Muwatalli II. Kadesh may also have been the largest chariot battle in all of human history. Despite all of the wealth and glory, the pharaohs of the New Kingdom had one big problem. Like all the pharaohs before them, they wanted to achieve life after death, and they wanted to continue to enjoy their earthly prosperity in the next life. But when they looked at the pyramid tombs of all the preceding pharaohs, they were confronted with a very disturbing fact. During the chaos of the various intermediate periods, every single royal tomb had been broken into and robbed. Even worse, in their search for all the loot that had been buried with the pharaohs, these robbers had torn apart the mummies. And, according to Egyptian belief, if your physical body was destroyed, then you had lost your chance at eternal life. Now, in retrospect, the pharaohs had to admit that maybe it had not been the best idea to place their bodies and their hopes for eternal life beneath the largest stone structures in all the world. This pretty much amounted to putting up a huge sign saying to robbers, "Dig here if you want treasure." So, the pharaohs of the New Kingdom came up with a new strategy. If, they reasoned, you want to keep your treasures in the afterworld, maybe you don't want to advertise where they are. Maybe you want your tomb to be a secret. And maybe, instead of building huge stone pyramids, instead you should construct underground tombs whose entrances can be sealed up and hidden so that no one knows where they are. Accordingly, the pharaohs go out and they find a hidden valley out in the desert. And in that spot, which becomes known as the Valley of the Kings, they dig one huge underground tomb after another. And in each of those, after a pharaoh had been interred with all his precious treasures, the entrance was sealed up and hidden. They actually used a special workforce of artisans and engineers who were quartered at an isolated and quarantined village in a further attempt to keep the location secret. Just as the pharaohs of the New Kingdom were unimaginably rich, these tombs now are just splendid beyond belief. The walls and the ceilings were completely covered with beautifully painted frescoes and reliefs. And mostly these recorded prayers, wishing for the pharaoh's safe journey through the challenges that faced him in the afterworld. And they also offered up spells to protect him. And this was a necessary step because the Egyptians' very ideas of how you reach the afterlife had been undergoing some changes. The New Kingdom, as we've seen, was a lot different from the kind of serene and perfect Old Kingdom. Everyone had seen that now in life you had to overcome great challenges at every turn in order to make the kingdom united and successful. And so they also figured that now you had to pass through various trials and challenges after death. So before your soul could attain immortality, it too had to overcome a series of challenges. And we'll come back to this belief in more detail a bit later. Most of these tombs took the form of a long, sloping tunnel, and rooms would branch off on either side of these. The very largest of these tombs contained over 100 rooms and sometimes even multiple levels. And in every room, there were just heaps of gold and jewels and other riches, and they were crammed full of art objects. Pharaohs would spend their entire reign preparing their tomb and the treasures that would go into them. And once these enormous underground warehouses had been stuffed with treasure and the pharaoh's mummy had been put in there, they were sealed up, and hopefully they would stay there for all eternity. Do you think it worked? Well, as I'm sure you probably know, it did not. Every single one of these magnificent tombs was found, was broken into, and was robbed. Now, there was one unusual tomb in the Valley of the Kings. There was just a tiny little thing, really 4 small closet-like cubicles. So it wasn't one of these long tunnels with rooms branching off it. And it's clear this place probably wasn't even meant to be a royal tomb. But what happens is the current pharaoh had died unexpectedly at young, and there hadn't been time to dig a real tomb for him. So what they did is they just fixed up these 4 little rooms in a hurry. Literally, they grabbed some furniture from the palace and just tossed it in. They didn't even arrange it nicely, and they stuck him in there. And he was one of the least important pharaohs, so why not? I mean, he was basically just a nobody as pharaohs go. In fact, this guy was so unimportant that when they were digging out one of the later proper grand tombs, they dumped the garbage and the rubble on top of that little tomb, and everybody forgot about it. Well, thousands of years later, when all the great royal tombs had been found, opened, and looted, and all those treasures had been stolen, melted down, or sold, that one little 4-room tomb remained. And in 1924, it was found by Howard Carter, and it remains probably the greatest archaeological find of all time. And it was, of course, as you probably guessed, the tomb of the pharaoh Tutankhamun, or as we call him more familiarly, King Tut. And hopefully you've seen some pictures of the treasures that came from that tomb, and they are incredible. The sheer amount of gold that emerged from even this minor tomb is stunning. The famous death mask, which is molded with a likeness of Tutankhamun's face, is made of thick hammered gold. The coffin that held his body was also solid gold, but it was encased inside another larger coffin of gold, and that was sealed into a giant box covered with gold, which itself was stuck inside 2 bigger boxes, each plated in gold. This is the sort of burial that they gave to their least important, most obscure pharaoh. And if this tiny tomb of just 4 closets yielded such riches, we can only dream of the sort of dazzling splendor that would have been found in a real tomb from a real pharaoh. One of these tombs that was hundreds of feet long, dozens of rooms, and big chambers. And it seems unlikely, but we can always dream that such a tomb will one day be found, unbroken into, and with all its treasures intact. All right, the New Kingdom was the time of a number of the most famous pharaohs, including another man named Akhenaten, who is famous for espousing a sort of sun worship that seemed to approach our more modern concept of monotheism, of belief in one God. Another famous pharaoh of the New Kingdom is Ramses II, and he was one of the greatest builders of all of Egyptian history. Many of the structures that if you go to Egypt today and you visit were built by him. He built the temple complex of Abu Simbel, for example, and he also built a large number of colossal statues of himself. Eventually, the power of Egypt in the New Kingdom once again goes into decline, and Egypt fragments and goes back to its constituent nomes. And the next phase of Egyptian history, which you can probably guess is labeled the Third Intermediate Period, the political history of this era is messy. Various parts of Egypt at times are ruled by some foreign powers. The Assyrians control part of Egypt. Later on, the Persian Empire controls all of Egypt. But at other times, indigenous pharaohs will briefly rise up and rule some or all of the land. One particularly interesting interlude during this time is a group of pharaohs known as the 25th dynasty. They ruled from 750 to 650 BC. And at this time, most of Egypt is ruled by pharaohs who came from the African, the more sub-Saharan kingdom of Kush, which was based around the city of Meroe. Now, in the last couple centuries before Alexander the Great, Egypt's power really declines. And at that era, it's usually reduced to the status of just being a province of other more powerful empires. Before we leave Egypt for a while, though, I want to return to that topic of religion and to look at some of the key aspects of Egyptian religion in a little more detail. And first, I want to talk about what is probably the single core myth that has to do with the gods and that really nicely summarizes a lot of the fundamental beliefs of the Egyptians. All right, the main characters in this myth are a happily married couple, and their names are Isis and Osiris. Isis and Osiris are not only husband and wife, but they're also brother and sister. And this sort of incestuous marriage was actually quite common at certain periods in Egyptian history. Now, as in any story, there's an evil character, and unfortunately, they have an evil brother named Set. Set is jealous of them, and so he comes up with a plot in which he captures Osiris, kidnaps him really, he locks him in a box, and then he throws the box into the Nile. Osiris's faithful wife, Isis, now has to embark on a long, difficult journey with many setbacks and trials, searching for his body. Eventually, she succeeds. She finds it. But Set gets his hands on the box again, and this time he takes Osiris and he chops him up into 14 pieces and scatters these all around. Poor Isis now has to embark on an even much, much longer and more difficult search, trying to find all the bits of Osiris. But in the end, she's very persistent. She manages to find 13 of the 14 pieces. And using her magic skills as a god, she glues Osiris back together, incidentally creating the very first mummy, and he sort of comes back to life and attains eternal life, becoming the lord of the underworld. All right, this myth involving the gods becomes a central metaphor for the Egyptians. Because just as Isis has to undergo a long, difficult journey, at the end of which, if everything goes right, there's immortality, so it is for humans. We have to undertake the long journey of life, along which there are often trials and setbacks and difficulties, but if everything goes right, at the end, we too have the hope of eternal life after death. By the way, if you don't already know this myth, you're probably wondering what was that 14th piece of Osiris that Isis couldn't find. I won't say other than to comment that it was a very personal and private part of Osiris, and that when she glued him back together, she replaced the missing piece with a wooden replica that apparently the couple were quite content with. But Osiris's story of life, death, and resurrection mirrors those great natural sequences of life, death, and rebirth that the Egyptians saw all around them in the sun, the Nile, and the seasons. A final, absolutely vital concept around which Egyptian life was centered was the idea of Ma'at. This is a term that's somewhat difficult to translate. It encompasses our modern notion of justice and morality, but it also includes a kind of a sense of order and even of divine equilibrium, that the universe is in balance. And it reflects this Egyptian conviction that the universe is very carefully arranged and it follows predictable patterns and it has predictable hierarchies. And it also ties into the way in which they believed you gained admission to the underworld after death. Again, mirroring the Isis-Osiris myth, they believed that after death, in order to gain entrance to the afterlife, your soul had to go on a long, difficult journey. And along the course of this were several tests that had to be passed. And what determined success or failure in these ordeals was whether or not you had led a just and moral life. In probably the key moment. You would come before the throne of Osiris, the lord of the underworld, and your heart, which the Egyptians believed contained your soul, was placed on one side of a set of scales. And on the other side was placed a single feather, which was called the feather of truth. And if you had been a good person, if you had lived an honest life, if you had not hurt others, you hadn't committed sins, then your heart would weigh the same as the truth, and you passed. But if you had been a bad person, you had harmed other people, you'd lied, stolen, committed sins, then your heart would be weighed down from living such an immoral life, and the scales would tip against you, and your heart was immediately flipped off the scales into the mouth of a hideous monster waiting below that devoured it, and your soul was snuffed out of existence. The end. If you passed the weighing of the heart ritual, you then still had to appear before a gathering of 42 gods and swear an oath of negative confession. And this was a series of statements that you had not committed various sins. And among these are, I have not committed any sins against man. I have not committed any sins against the gods. I have not killed. I have not stolen. I have not committed adultery. I have not bullied the poor man. I have not cheated any man. I have not caused any man to be hungry. I have not taken milk from the mouths of little children. I am pure. I am pure. If your oath was accepted by the gods, then finally your soul was granted entrance to the eternal paradise. And the Egyptian emphasis on mot and on moral, law-abiding behavior as a prerequisite for admission to the afterlife can be linked, I think, directly to the stable, orderly environment in which they lived, where even the powerful forces of nature seemed to observe a set of rules, and the whole world seemed to follow nicely defined, tidy patterns. Ancient Mesopotamia and Egypt began in fairly close proximity to one another. They're both roughly in the ancient Near East. And in both places, as we've seen, the course of their development and their fundamental beliefs were very heavily influenced by the physical surroundings in which they arose. But these two cultures that we've looked at also offer an interesting contrast. Ancient Mesopotamia had a harsh climate, which was dominated by unpredictable, destructive events, those floods. Whereas Egypt's was much more really nurturing, and it followed a predictable, regular pattern. Mesopotamia had no internal boundaries and lots of routes of communication to neighboring areas. But Egypt was isolated and protected by geography. It's possible to take these environmental differences and attribute to them the fact that Mesopotamia gave rise to a long series of different, unstable empires, and to a worldview that emphasized pessimism, fatalism, and the sort of arbitrariness of the gods. Whereas on the other hand, Egypt produced a single, long-lasting culture that saw the universe as stable and ruled by justice. And I think nothing really encapsulates these fundamental differences in outlook better than comparing the respective ideas of these two cultures regarding one of the most fundamental questions that really all human beings ask: what does the afterlife look like? First of all, let's consider the Egyptian afterlife. In Egyptian beliefs, the land of the dead was envisioned as a lush, green paradise. The sun shone down benevolently on a rich, well-watered fields, and there was a kind of perpetual springtime. Harvests were always abundant, nobody suffered any disease or pain or suffering, and everyone, whether they were rich or poor, were assigned equal plots of land to take care of. But even the actual labor of tending these nice little fields was minimal because the dead were usually buried with miniature clay sort of humanoid figures called ushabtis. And it was believed that in the underworld, these ushabtis would magically come to life and act as your servants. And so all the nasty, ordinary physical tasks would be taken care of by them. The inhabitants of this pleasant world could enjoy all the same possessions and pastimes and comforts that they had when alive, even down to playing board games and having hobbies. And that's why they were buried with board games and hobby equipment. But entrance to this paradise was only granted to those who had lived good, moral lives. However, even those souls who were judged unworthy didn't have to suffer in some sort of hell. They simply ceased to exist. Well, what about the Mesopotamian afterlife? How did the cruel, arbitrary, and unpredictable nature of Mesopotamian geography affect how they looked at the next world? For the Mesopotamians, after death, you entered a underworld located within the earth, where the spirits of the dead had to dwell for all eternity. There was no light in this underworld, so that the dead had to just stumble about through a kind of constant, inky blackness. The environment was like a desert. It was hot and dusty. And even though the dead suffered from intense thirst, there was never any water anywhere to relieve their suffering. I suppose it goes without saying there was also no food in this terrible place. And so the inhabitants of the underworld had to fill their mouths with dust and just chew upon it in a kind of a grotesque parody of eating. And all people ended up there. Whether in life they had been good or bad, rich or poor, it made no difference at all. Everyone was naked, and everything that they owned was left behind. And there seems to have been nothing else in this empty land besides dust. The dead simply were condemned to wander aimlessly through this appalling landscape forever. Now, some scholars like to discount the effects of environment on civilization, and they say that other factors, human choice, are much more responsible for the features that each culture displays. But even if you accept a less sweeping view of the effects of environment than I've presented, I think it's hard not to see how the distinctive geographic features of these two regions played a pivotal role in how the cultures developed there. And they're a major factor in such key things such as the Mesopotamian societal pessimism and their desperate interest in finding ways to predict the future. And on the other hand, we can clearly see the role of the environment in the Egyptians' long-lasting obsession with orderly cycles of life, death, and rebirth. These last 4 lectures have introduced the earliest civilizations of the Mediterranean and have focused on how environment shaped their culture. In the next 4 lectures, they will take us first to India, where we'll look at the origins of a third great early civilization, before we end up returning once again to the Mediterranean to look at some other cultures. And collectively, the next 4 lectures will continue, I think, to illustrate how environment forms culture. But they'll also introduce a second major theme, and that is the huge problems which are faced by historians and archaeologists when we try to interpret an ancient civilization when all that remains of it is physical archaeological evidence, and there are no surviving written documents to help bring it to life. Thank you.